Good morning. We are here with Scott Roy, CEO at Whitten and Roy Partnership for a new podcast, Beyond Grants. Scott, can you please introduce yourself and your organization?
Sure. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you for having me on your podcast. Um, so my name is Scott Roy. I'm a founder, a co-founder, I should say, and CEO of Whitten and Roy Partnership. We're a change management consultancy that focuses our specialty in the global South. So we have for the last 17 years worked in about 50 countries, in primarily in Africa and Asia, but also in LATAM. And our specialty is working with organizations that are wanting to explore how to become successful as social entrepreneurships. Okay. So a social impact organization that has a business attitude or business function in order to deliver the impact they're trying to create. So that's as opposed to NGOs that get grants and then take that and then perform some sort of service or provide products more or less for free. In this situation, a social enterprise is really designed more for permanence and sustainability, where they actually have a business function selling a product or a service. But oftentimes, organizations that come from that impact background just simply don't know how to do it well. And so that's where we come in to help strengthen their ability to do that and amplify their impact.
Very well. So you spent over 20 years in the private sector, and then you ran a foundation, and then you changed. What happened inside that foundation that made you change and do something else?
Well, it's interesting. I've always been entrepreneurial, Claudio, and I was for 11 years in the publishing sector, and then for 11 years building an insurance company from scratch, basically. That now has done very, very well and works in about 50 states in the United States. But I sold my interest in that, and I retired at age 42 or so and then got bored. And then I thought, okay, well, I don't want to go back into building businesses. So what if I give back? That's what I want to do. I want to give back. So I went into nonprofit management and became the executive director of a foundation. And that foundation had been going for 20 years and then decided that the senior people in that organization were retiring, the founders were retiring, and there was a belief that they wanted to run more like a business. So they hired a business guy to help them do that. And essentially I was like oil to the water of that organization, or maybe I was the water to the oil of that organization. And that it was a big shock to them to go from being, sort of this lazy NGO charitable organization to being a more regimented, more organized, more disciplined organization that actually had a revenue motive. And so I was there for 5 years, and I did a lot of things that actually helped that organization move away from the founders and then get set on a new course. But after 5 years, I'd had enough. So I resigned and then got into consulting. And so I think I bring a very unique perspective to the developing world and the global South in this sector, in the sense that I really understand the conflict that oftentimes happens between a business approach and sort of a charitable approach, and then what are the ways through that so that it works. And so that's what our consultancy has been committed to over the last 17 years.
Very good. Now, about consultancy, in your work in the development sector, you put a lot of emphasis on the word sales,
Hmm.
even when people push back. Why is
Hmm.
sales still a dirty word in this sector? And what does the cost on the ground? What is the cost for people on the ground?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, the world all across many cultures associates sales with doing things that are underhanded or uh, lying, cheating, stealing, etc. That's a common um, sort of attribution of what sales is like. And so therefore, the word selling doesn't find its way really easily into the nonprofit sector because, nonprofit sector is for people, for impact, it has a social good. The last thing in the world that an organization wants to be associated with is being deceptive or being silver-tongued, with people and being sly, etc. But what I know about sales professionally is that fortunately I was trained my very first job in sales, I was trained by an organization that really had a very high ethical standard when it comes to sales. And so for me, sales has always been an admirable profession. It's been something that I'm proud of what I do and how I do it. And essentially, what we're committed to it at Whitten and Roy is to help organizations to see that sales in and of itself is not a dirty word or a dirty practice. It's in fact it's actually a very noble profession because it helps people to solve problems. And so sometimes they're very aware of those problems. Sometimes they're not so aware of those problems. And so therefore, a salesperson's job is to help people think about the problems they have in a way where it motivates them to decide, do I want to do something about this or not? And so sales works very, very well in behavior change in helping people wake up to the reality in which they live. A good example of that would be, like sanitation or water, where people are putting up with what they've done for, their generation and the generation before them and the generation before them. And now to wake up to the point of saying, I'm going to do something about it. And oftentimes it requires much more than just health messaging to make that happen. So selling is a very, very effective way to make that happen.
I totally agree. And now is the time because of the funding crisis for so many organizations in the nonprofit sector to wake up to this new reality. So, in one of our previous conversation, you told me something that made me think a lot. You say that NGOs spend decades trying to break dependency cycles in the community that they serve, only to run their own organization the exact same way into dependency. Can you
Hmm.
unpack that?
Yeah, I mean, yes, yes, you can impact that. I mean, it's like when we do our work, we have a client organization, oftentimes an NGO that's making that transition, or it could also be an impact business that that already has made that transition into sustainability and attempting to be sustainable by generating their own revenues. Um, a lot of it has to do with the attitude of the leadership and the attitude of the people who are actually on the ground doing the work. And what I mean by that is that, if you have beliefs and expectations of, gee, we're always going to be receiving grants. We have to go out and find that money and, and get our fundraisers to go find that money, and then all of a sudden you have something like USAID blowing up, and then that really sent a lot of organizations into a tailspin. But I think really what it speaks to so loudly is that we haven't really been committed to sustainability. Many organizations have not. Maybe they've been committed in the concept and the words of sustainability, but haven't really been thinking in terms of what are the systems that need to be in place, what are the skills that people need to have, and how do we make people truly independent and to be free of our support when we decide to leave, when we're leaving. In our business, we're only in there for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, whatever, depending on what the shape is of the project we're in. But we're already planning our departure as part of the strategy of how do we get out of this so that that organization doesn't depend on us to deliver those services, right? So, in fact, this morning I just had a conversation with an organization that sells water filters, and our work with them right now is to break that dependency on us. And we're actually helping provide the scaffolding that is creating that transition. And we're well underway with that, but we need to deliberately back ourselves out of any kind of support that we're providing for them so that they can stand on their own 2 feet and continue from there and grow.
Very well. So, because of your work, you travel a lot, and one of your trip recently was in Kenya. And,
Yes.
and, and in Kenya, you were sitting with an organization that lost their USAID funds overnight.
Hmm.
What does that conversation actually look like when you walk into the room with an organization that is still in shock?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I was actually speaking to the CEO. I won't disclose the organization, but I was speaking to the CEO. They work in multiple African countries, and she basically was saying to me, "Look, we know we have to generate revenue. We know that we must do that, but we really don't know how. We're not people who have that mindset that every service that we render needs to be monetized and either needs to be paid for by the end user or by somebody else who is interested in the welfare of that end user. And that sounds like welfare, but it's really you have to meet the reality of A, we can't depend on grant funding to continue this delivery of services. And B, our services cannot be monetized and bought by everyone, you see, because there truly is a group at the base of the pyramid, of the economic pyramid, that truly are hand to mouth, are truly living hand to mouth day to day, and they're living on less money than what they need in order to live and thrive. And so that reality is there. And so we need to be thinking about what are the ways that we can treat that group of people who are truly destitute and differentiate between those people and other people who have some ability to pay and then differentiate those people from people who really do have the ability to pay. All of whom, all these people actually live at the base of the pyramid. And so what's happened is programming hasn't been in many organizations. I can't say this is sweeping across all organizations, but in many organizations, it hasn't been discerning those three different levels of poor. The ultra poor, the poor, and the medium poor, right? And so that's part of the thinking that we need to bring forward into this and make it okay that we as an organization may not have the ability now to be able to serve that lowest echelon. We may not be able to do that right now, but we always maintain the intent to find ways to serve that population. And so therefore we don't abandon that group, but we also have to deal with the reality of what we can do and who we can do that for and how we're going to use other groups to generate revenue that keep us sustainable and then give us an ability in the future to be able to support those groups at the lowest part of the pyramid. No easy answers here. There are
No,
no easy answers.
no, unfortunately, there aren't easy answers.
But there are
I
some
will
answers, but there are some answers that where that they're not being explored. And that's where we want to really stretch our imagination to figure out how to do that.
absolutely, and that's the point of these podcasts is to inspire people to think differently. I would like to go back to this sales idea. And you worked with hundreds of organizations on hundreds of projects and reached millions of people. At what point did you realize that selling well and doing good were not in conflict? They were like complementary to improve the life of millions of people.
Sure. Well, Claudio, actually, I've known that my entire selling career. So I'm 68 today, and I
Wow.
started selling when I
Oh,
was 20. And so
happy
for 40,
birthday. Wow.
yeah, close to, yeah. So 48 years of doing this, almost 49 years.
Wow.
And what I can say is I was trained well with the right attitude going into it. My actual first job was selling educational books door
Wow.
to door in America. Okay, so I would knock on people's doors who had children in school or even preschool children. And we had products that fit different age categories. And so my job was to find out, how are your kids doing in school? Do they enjoy school? And what are the subjects that they have difficulty with? And how about you as a parent? Do they ever come to you for help? And how confident are you and comfortable are you with helping them with their homework, et cetera? And so it was a consultation to find out what were the needs of this family, what kind of challenges or problems did they have with education and making sure their children received all the support that was necessary. And based on those answers, then either we would say, gee, I think your kids are going to really love what we have to offer, or we may even say in some cases, gee, I don't think what we have is going to make much of a dent at all to help you. Instead, we'd recommend doing this, you say, or doing that instead. And so we were taught from the very beginning to find out, is there a problem or is there a need that this family has? And only then our job is to help fill that need or solve that problem. And our job really is to help people, and when we're selling, is to help people think deeply, much more deeply than they have been up to that point when we first knocked on their door, right? To help them think more deeply about their situation so that they then can make an intelligent decision about whether or not we should go ahead and buy this for our family, you see. And so from the very beginning, we've always used a very, very highly ethical consultative model from my early days selling books to then in the insurance business and then going into what I'm doing now. I mean, I sell our services now to organizations, and it gives me a great deal of pride and pleasure when we're able to say, we're not the right people for you. In fact, I know somebody else you should be talking to. It's, such and such because they've got that specialty that we don't have. And I always feel great when I have that kind of conversation, quite frankly. And I think people need to realize that selling is not the art of convincing people to buy. That's what most people think it is. It's the skill or the art of helping people think more deeply about the problems they have and then solving that problem if it's there, you say.
So I would like to go back to the concept of attitude and changing your mindset. So
Mhm.
faith-based organizations, community health workers, education programs, you have seen all of them face this moment where they have to start charging for something that they used to give away for free. Okay,
Mhm.
what does that conversation look like internally? And how do you help people to get through it, to change their attitude, their approach?
Sure. That's a great question. And can remember many times over the last 17 years that we have helped people through that knothole. Okay. And I call it, a knothole is like a piece of wood, like a plank of wood, and there's a knot in the wood that you pull out. It's the where the old branch is, right? Okay. And so I've always thought about writing a book called Through the Knothole. Okay. Because that's a knothole that people have to go, from the state of revenue that's given to us to then distribute further. I've got to go through that knothole and get my skin scraped off to be able to get to the other side of it. And then also I think of it as the knothole, the NOT, not just the KNOT, but the knothole of no, I don't want to do that. No, I'm not going to do that, you see, in the sense of the resistance that people have because of moving from one state of revenue generation to another state of revenue generation. I might have some beliefs and some preconceived notions and maybe even some experiences that were distasteful about revenue models where there's a sale or selling involved in that. And so I've got to take a look at those beliefs and examine them and see if they really are factually not aligned with where I want to go or where I'm being asked to go, you see. And so what happens is that there's a polarity that exists between sort of an NGO grants-based organization. There's a philosophical feel here that looks different than the philosophical feel here, which is the user based pay system. And so it's like they look like they're polar opposites, and actually they're not. And there's really a good book by a man by the name of Barry Palmer, PhD, called Polarity Management. And I really strongly suggest that if anybody on this podcast or listening to the podcast would, are experiencing this sort of polarity in the organization where, we were a grants-based organization, we have to move over here, but I'm resisting it, my people are resisting it, etc. Read this book and then do the exercises in how to rationalize that move. And I think you'll be amazed at what you find. But essentially, the bottom line is that there are benefits to both sides. There are upsides to both sides, to revenue generated by grants and revenue generated by the organization. There are upsides to that. And there are downsides to both models, you see. And so the secret is, how do you actually bring those two together so that you can realize the upsides of both models and then minimize or eliminate the downsides of both models? That's really where the polarity exists, is between the upsides and the downsides. And how do we manage that so that we actually can get most of the upsides and have the sustainability that that brings?
Very good. My last question. So,
Sure.
about this new model, or a model that actually already exists, the sales approach, providing benefit and then charge for those benefits. So NGOs, they don't need to invent anything. The model is already there for them to consider, and it has many successful stories. So why, especially nowadays in this time of crisis when it comes to funding for grants, why people are not embracing or considering more this model? What's the real excuse? Why are we still having this conversation? And finally, in your experience, do you see a change? Are people more open? Do they have appetite now to embrace or consider this different model beyond grants?
Sure. Well, as they say, necessity becomes the mother of invention, right? And so if you have that necessity, then it's really going to force the issue, isn't it? I think first of all, Claudio, is it, you have to realize that this idea of changing is really a strong attitude problem, okay? It's my attitude or my mindset toward the need to do this, to be ability to have the ability to self-generate funds and do that in whichever way you do that. And I mean, it doesn't always have to be the end user paying for this. It could be selling to a government and advocating to a government to actually pick up the tab for that. Now, I'm not saying that's easy. That's not easy. I didn't mention this earlier, but I actually was a lobbyist for 5 years here in Tennessee, where I'm from, and I used all of the selling skills that I knew, along with a team of people, all of the in really complex selling skills, business to business type complex selling skills, and applied them to changing laws. And we were very successful at changing nine long-standing, couple of hundred-year-old laws around domestic relations that have had a huge impact on the people of Tennessee, millions of people over the years. That was way back in the 90s that I was doing that. But I can certainly say that it doesn't always come to a transaction between a seller and a buyer of a product or a service. It can also be like a government, or it can be CSR, corporate social responsibility, going to a large corporate and knowing how to actually approach them and to help them see the benefit of providing funding to be able to support a particular part of the population. I think that's something that has been largely overlooked as being a real strong potential solution provider, to some of the funding crisis here. But those relationships with government and also with corporates take time to develop. Okay, it doesn't necessarily mean a long time. I mean, I think government is probably longer, than it does with a corporate, just from decision making. But then, then some organizations are looking at, the actual people at the base of pyramid paying their own way or a portion of their own way. So I think first of all, you've got to shift the mindset from impossibility to possibility, okay?
Yes.
And take full responsibility for saying our organization is going to not just survive, but it will thrive, and it's going to thrive in a new way. So I don't necessarily know how it's going to survive or thrive, or you go from surviving just, into thriving. I don't know that yet, but now that I've shifted my mindset into exploring all possibilities, now I have possibility, you see. But I can't get there if I'm still resisting,
Yes.
a self-generating revenue model, you see. So that's the first thing. Secondly, you may have people who don't have experience in building a revenue generating model. And so therefore they need to somehow get that expertise. Well, I mean, that's part of the service that we render. We're not the only people that do it, but we're probably the longest having done it. And so we're very good at helping organizations to monetize what they do and then figure out their go-to-market strategy, et cetera, and then helping them execute it so that it actually works. So that's the second thing is you've got to have the strategy right. And, what are we actually going to do that? And so you develop that and then you have to test it, usually in a pilot to make sure that it works. And then, from there, go. I'll give you a good example. A client currently in Eastern Africa they were selling a product for 2,500 shillings, okay, and they were selling it at a subsidized rate, and they actually needed to increase it to 3,500 so that they would actually make a just a marginal profit on this. And they had tried to do that and they failed at it because
Mm.
they just did not believe that people had money to spend on that. And so we got involved and we were hired a couple of years after they tried to do this. And our consultant came in and said, actually, you need to raise the price to 5,000. And everyone in the room just, their eyes rolled back. They
Wow.
said, oh, it's impossible.
Wow.
And so we have a skill called rewiring. And what
Mm.
we did is we led them through a rewiring exercise to get from impossibility about that to possibility. And
Mm.
then once the consultant got them to that level of possibility, now we can begin looking at what could we do. And so just on the telephone a couple of days ago, not only did their sales double, okay,
Wow. Wow.
at the higher price, right? But they actually decided to raise the price again to 6,600 shillings, you say, and they're finding their sales are just doing fine. So it was a belief problem, you say.
Mm.
It was and there's some skill involved in it too. I mean, we can't discount that. And so that's again what we help organizations do is to develop the skills that they need in order to actually execute that strategy, right? So those are the a couple of things I would say are really important. First mindset, then strategy, then skill, and then execution of at least a pilot to test if it's going to work or not.
Great. Uh, Scott, thank you so much for these precious insights. I am sure the audience will find them really relevant, and also hopefully they'll start thinking about possibilities instead of focusing on what will not come back because of
Mm,
this crisis.
sure. Well, if anybody's interested in more information about that, we have a book out that is very appropriate in this realm called "Sell Well, Do Good." Okay.
Uh-huh.
And it's all about how do you use a commercial approach to create impact. I mean, how do you bring, sort of business acumen and skills into serving an impact organization and doing so that people can accept it, learn how to do it, and do well at it, and how to do it in a way that you're proud of, that you never have to worry that people are cheating, stealing, or doing anything that would be underhanded in the sales process. So Sell Well, Do Good is available on Apple Books, and it's also available Barnes and Nobles and as well as Amazon in both electronic format and also hardbound.
Great. Scott, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you, Claudio. Take care.